Welcome back to Your 1230, the only podcast where our guests tell their story with the help of just 12 questions in 30 minutes. I'm your host, Mike Salitro, and today we are very excited to be joined by Phyllis Leavitt. Phyllis graduated from Antioch University with a master's degree in psychology and counseling in 1989. She co-directed a sexual abuse treatment program called Parents United in Santa Fe, New Mexico until 1991 before going into private practice full-time. She's been a psychotherapist treating children, families, couples, and individual adults for over 30 years and has worked extensively with abuse and dysfunctional family dynamics, their aftermath, and some of the most important elements for healing. She's also published two books, A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire, and has a new book called America in Therapy coming out soon. She lives in Taos, New Mexico with her husband and currently focused on writing. Phyllis, welcome. We are really excited to be speaking with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today.
Of course, of course. And I want to go back to the beginning of the bio. This is a very serious subject matter and can be difficult to talk about, let alone make your everyday, your professional career, helping others who are going through very difficult times. How did you know this was for you, or how did you know that you could help others in this field specifically?
Well, I think like so many people, I was drawn to doing the work that had actually helped me. I went to therapy myself when I was in my mid 30s, and it opened up a whole world of understanding for me about, how important our conditioning is on the lives we end up leading, the choices we make, the coping mechanisms we develop, the attractions we have, and particularly how we deal with stress. So we learned so much of that from our families of origin. And one of the things I learned when I became a therapist, and actually when I was a client for the first time, which was before I went to graduate school, was that the role models of our families and our close communities really imprint us very deeply with how we deal with life, what we expect of ourselves, what we expect of others, what coping mechanisms are acceptable, what's praised, what's punished. Um, and so, in knowing that so many people have different conditioning, and then we're all trying to work it out with each other in a family, in a community, in a country, from a psychological point of view, you can see that that's a setup for either amazing transformation and cooperation, or very intense difficulties and conflict and strife. So once I looked through that family lens of what family conditioning is about and I saw our whole country as the family of America dealing with the very same issues and really not knowing how, because a lot of that psychological knowledge is not common knowledge.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, the family conditioning specifically, and you tie it with stress, because I think those are two things that are either underestimated or just assume, well, isn't this what everybody is going through, or isn't this normal for any other family dynamic, or this is what's happening in other households, so it's not special. Whereas in reality, stress can really paralyze us in many different areas and can have quite a toll, both physically and mentally. And the family conditioning part is really a good one because you kind of just take it as, well, this is normal. I don't even know this is happening to me because it seems
That's
normal to you. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's what jumped out at me with your answer. Kind of building off that, you mentioned the country as a family. How did you draw that parallel?
Well, it wasn't that hard. First of all, what I want to say is, having been a therapist for so many years, it's really, I don't know if it's common knowledge, and it may be to some people, but the level of stress and the level of dysfunction and the level of actually overt abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, psychological abuse, sometimes spiritual abuse in families, is actually very high in our country and perhaps around the world. I don't live in another country, so I can only speak from my experience, but um, the average person that I met as a therapist, people functioning in their daily lives, holding their jobs, raising their kids, having extracurricular activities, going to the dentist, like what we consider the average American or a normal person, often carries very deep wounds that they're trying to manage, and not show the world. And there's a lot of pain and suffering under the surface for many, many people. And wasn't a far cry to understand, okay, our country is just made up of millions of individuals. And if family life is really stressful, and what my observation is that these are mental health issues. When families are overtly dysfunctional or abusive, this is a sign of very disturbed mental health, on a continuum. And if we're having this in our homes, and a lot of people are, and that's not to say that there aren't some great families out there and wonderful people having wonderful childhoods, but I haven't met many, honestly. So if we're a country of individuals, we bring that dysfunction where we go. And then certainly something that I learned from my own life and from being a therapist, that people came because they're repeating the same dysfunction in their present adult lives that they experienced in their childhood, whether they're reenacting something themselves or they're unable to cope with present circumstances because of their conditioning being faulty. It just gets repeated and repeated. So if this is happening on the individual level, what does that do to a country? What does that do to a community? If a whole segment of our population is being discriminated against, what happens to them when they try to function in the world? What can we expect?
That as you draw that line, it makes a lot of sense. And kind of taking that forward, the book American Therapy, is that where the title comes from, or what can you tell us about the book?
Yeah. So basically, the big aha for me was um, that not only are there many, many people suffering from emotional, mental, sexual, and other kinds of violence. Poverty is a form of societal abuse. Rampant racial and gender discrimination is a form of societal abuse of those people. And so it became clear to me that large institutions operate the same way families do, with the same either great outcomes, if they're operating on healthy family dynamics, or they're hurting a lot of people if they're operating on dysfunctional and abusive dynamics. And looking at some of what's happening in our country politically and socially and culturally over the last several years, it became really clear to me that many of the exact dynamics that I have worked with dysfunctional and abusive families are playing out on a national scale. Um, so I can give you an example if that would help.
Please, yes.
So one of the and in my book I go into great detail about what that looks like. What are the dynamics that you find in the most dysfunctional and hurtful families, and how do they correlate to what we see going on in parts of our country today? And this is, again, you go to the doctor when you're in pain. You don't go to the doctor if you're feeling great. So we're talking about the pain. We're not there is a lot of greatness in America. I just really want to say that there's a lot of amazing people doing incredible things to help their neighbor, to be of service, and to just lead, wonderful lives and bring up their children in wonderful ways. But we're not talking about them at the moment. They're there, they're a wonderful resource, and they give us hope. So one of the dynamics that you find in an abusive family, for instance, if you have, let's just say, a parent who is physically abusing a child, let's just say, one of the dynamics that you find is that they blame the victim for what they're doing. I had to hit you because you did blah, blah. You didn't do your homework. Your room was a mess. Rather than take responsibility for the fact that they behaved violently, they blame the victim for the abuse. And we do that a lot in our country. And I think we've learned that as a society, that certain people deserve bad treatment because because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because they are poor, rather than understanding that the way we treat people has a lot to do with the symptoms they have. So for instance, let's just say a child is wetting the bed, child that's too old to be wetting the bed, sometimes that child will be abused. will be hurt, will be punished, will be shamed, will be blamed for having a behavior that is associated with a little, with a toddler. Rather than understanding that when a child wets the bed, if they're, let's say they're 10 or something like that, and I've worked with kids like this, it's a sign of emotional distress. It's actually a symptom of something that's bothering them, and their anxiety is coming out through their body. Just like if you have a disease, your body is going to have a symptom. And so when people of any age, children, adults, teenagers, have certain symptoms, we in the world of psychology understand that those symptoms are a cry for help for some underlying cause. And it's not worthy of punishment, it's worthy of help, if that makes sense. And so when we look at our larger society, and this is something I talk about in great detail in my book, and I'm giving you a very condensed version. If we look at the uptick in mass murders, for instance, in racial violence, and so many people now, going on the internet and saying very hateful things about other human beings, these are symptoms also of what I call the pain in the human family of America, in the family of America. Yes, we don't condone, many of us don't condone that kind of behavior. And we certainly want people to be responsible for not hurting other human beings. But we also have to understand that their symptoms are also a cry for help for something that's not working in the family of our country. And I think the mass murderers are a good example of that, because if you just take a minute and you try to understand what could possibly be going on in someone, that they're so disconnected from their own humanity, they're so unable to feel the impact of what they're inflicting on another human being. They're so enraged or so distraught or so depressed or so traumatized that the only thing that they can see to do to express their pain is to harm or kill other human beings. We're talking about a severe level of mental unwellness. And something caused that. That person didn't get born that way. Nobody gets born that way. Maybe there's a few people out there who are born with, certain neurological deficiencies, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about some little baby grew up in some way with some conditioning that destroyed their connection to other human beings. And we're now looking at what are those family dynamics that people who have committed terrible crimes grew up in. But I think we have to look larger at the larger family of America and the whole system that people are growing up in. Is it poverty? Is it excessive drug use? Is it violence in their communities? Is it lack of access to resources or healthcare or education? And the list goes on and on. So just like we would want to hold an individual family responsible to take care of their children the best they could, can we hold ourselves responsible as a country to take care of all Americans the best we can? Or do we hold that for just a few?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot there. I'm going to try to tie it together and go back to the beginning, because something I wrote down as you said, it really struck me. As you gave examples and worked your way through that answer, I don't think many people will argue that victim blaming is correct, or that is something that should be done on a large level. Although it happens all the time, and that I think most people would say, no, that's not correct. But you give the example of a parent hitting a child or being unhappy and doing something, and then blaming that child when they're not following directions. And I think that's kind of the line of distinction I want to draw, where I think that behavior, most parents or even a third party observer would say, no, that's okay. But it kind of is in line with the other examples that you give, where there is somebody who is being abused, being taken advantage of, or being hurt, and that we are justifying the behavior of the adult or this kind of superior in the relationship there, based on the situation. So without taking those levels, what is something either in that example or another example that we can start doing in our homes to reinforce positive behavior and get away from kind of a dysfunctional relationship where there's that power dynamic, or where it may not be the traditional victim that we think of, but we're doing something that will have harm down the line or even in the immediate future?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned both as a parent myself and as a therapist, and I worked with children for a long time, and then I kind of morphed into working more with the adults because I saw that that was where the most impact could actually be made. But one of the things I realized is that we have to separate out the behavior from the underlying emotional condition. Um, and yes, we do have to be responsible for our behavior. We want to be able to hold others responsible for their behavior, but not from a point of view of hatred or blame or shame or retaliation, but from a point of view of how did this occur? How did this person get to this place? Whether it's a kid, hitting their sister, or a government official knowingly falsely jailing someone that they know is innocent of the crime. How did they get there? So we want to hold people accountable for their inhumane behaviors or their abusive behaviors, but we also really want to understand. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book America in Therapy is because in the world of psychology, the focus is not blame. The focus is not shame. The focus is not retribution. The focus is on healing. So whether you're the recipient of some terrible behavior or you're the person who did it, the focus is still on healing everyone. And there are some people for sure that we don't know how to heal. There are people who have been so badly injured that probably the only thing we can do is separate them from society in order to help other people be safe. But even so, we can still help them even in that position, even in that in incarceration. There's a very beautiful documentary I saw called The Dhamma Brothers. I think it's Dhamma. I'm not sure if I'm spelling it right, but it was about I think it was a couple of men who were Buddhists who went into a prison in a southern state and taught a volunteer group of prisoners to do some kind of meditation. There wasn't, and it was just out of the goodness of their heart that they wanted to offer a meditative practice. And in the course of the documentary, several of the men told their stories of how they got there. And one of them really stood out to me. And many of them were murderers and they were in there for life. In fact, they might have all been in there for life. As a little boy, I don't remember the family circumstance, but his mother was a single mother. And I hope I'm telling this story right, but she probably out of her own desperation, who knows what happened to her, but she took her children to some little cabin where they were living out of town, and she left them there, and she never came back. And I believe, and I might have this story wrong, but he had a horrible life after that. The kids ended up in foster care. They had been abandoned. And he ended up becoming a murderer. But we have to ask ourselves, we have to look at the little boy inside of him. And you could even see it in his face when he was telling the story. And he wasn't justifying anything he did. He was just talking about what happened to him. And we can't imagine that pain. I have a very distinct memory of when I was 5 years old of playing at a friend's house. And I don't know what happened with my parents, but they were gone. And I came home to an empty house and I was freaked out. Just sat in a ball on the floor until they got back because I was so scared. I can't even imagine what it would be like for these kids that nobody came back and they're all alone out in this house and they don't know where they are. I don't even know how they found their way to help. So I think we have to have great empathy for even the most violent among us. And really, and again, and have our goal be treatment, have our goal be help, have our goal be compassion, even with limit setting, even with holding people accountable. And I think we're far from that, because we're very much as a society still looking for who to blame for our problems. And you can
Go ahead.
interrupt me anytime.
No, no,
I
no,
have
please
so
go
much
ahead.
to say.
I was going to say, I'm glad that you came to empathy there, because I think that's something that, again, most people would say that's how you should, that's proper, that's what we should do. But as you go through that story, I think accountability and justice is what where most people are going to end up when there is a universal wrong, that it's this person did something wrong, they should be punished, and that's kind of where it ends. How can we not only understand what it's like to be more empathetic, but how can we start doing that on a day-to-day basis where we can kind of move toward that larger goal, where it's not just about accountability and justification, that it's an understanding that there is a reason, that there are symptoms behind these causes, that it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray in these situations.
There's a lot, and there are symptoms behind the cause. That absolutely, and I try to go into that in detail by telling stories like that in my book. Sort of disguising people's identity, but telling stories that are real stories out of the lives of people that I've worked with, to try to even build that empathy in writing about it, because we don't know anybody else's stories, and we do live in a society still that encourages us to look good and look like we have it all together and look like we're fine, and we can manage, when a lot of people aren't, and they go home and they drink, or they go home and they rage, or they go home and they don't go home. And so part of that is really, I think, I mean, there's many pieces to this, but I think we've just started, for instance, with some of the people who have committed terrible crimes, to begin to talk in a public way about their childhoods. People who are brought up with good boundaries, who are loved, who have their basic necessities met, who have a sense of belonging, who are encouraged to be their best selves and given opportunity, don't become mass murderers. They just don't. And so we have to look at what does happen to people. And I'm really glad that some of those stories are coming out. Children who were, thrown through the foster care system, or they had two addicted parents, or they were violently, mistreated as children. Something happens to them, and their own sense of their own humanity gets injured and sometimes is inaccessible. So, but the reason why I'm saying all that is we don't know. I don't know if the person behind the checkout counter who's a grumpy has a life like that. I don't know. I don't know what their day was like. I don't know what they brought to work that day. And I can be kind. I can say, "How are you?" I can smile. Um, One of the things that I learned, as a sort of a nutshell thing that I'll say, is, as a therapist, is that the vast majority of what we consider mental and emotional unwellness is caused by an injury to love, or a lack of love. Love is the best food for human beings. Love and a sense of belonging and being valued are the best food for human beings. And when people don't get that, they're symptomatic. And we can give it to a random person on the street just by being friendly, just by being patient, just by trying to be understanding. We can all give that to our neighbors, and we can help heal a lot of what's going on in America just by being that kind of empathetic, compassionate person ourselves. And even if there's a problem, which there are, we have problems with people every day. Who doesn't? Things that make us mad, things that make us frustrated, things that are upsetting, things that are horrifying. We can still learn to address them in some way that's nonviolent. And I think that's the key, is nonviolent conflict resolution. And as a country, we are not role modeling that in a very severe way. And it's a cause for great alarm for not just myself, but I'll say for myself and many people, that some of our most powerful people in the positions of the greatest power are not modeling anything close to nonviolent conflict resolution. In fact, they're modeling the opposite. And our young people are seeing this. It's all over social media. And this is like a parent role model for a child. And if this is what you're exhibiting and this is what you're calling appropriate and justified, then you help other people justify violent behavior as well. And it's very very frightening to know now that if you have a different opinion and you have a loud voice in our society, you could be getting death threats just for having a different opinion. This is what I call mental unwellness. And I'll say this last sentence and then please jump back in. We are being conditioned to believe that these behaviors are justified on the basis of ideological differences. But in fact, they're signs of mental ill health, because mentally healthy people do not behave that way. They don't slander people with different opinions or threaten violence. They don't.
No, even a step further to where you end there with mental health and just being open to other ideas is I don't want to say necessarily natural, but it's the way to learn. Is that my
Right.
perspective is my perspective. It might be correct. It probably is not. Even if it is somewhat correct, there's probably a better way. There's a different way to look at it, and a differing of opinion is generally, if not always, a good thing to understand. Different perspectives, different ways from coming from similar situations. So the idea that I'm not going to accept or be open to anything that's different than the way I think or the way I believe is just fundamentally wrong. The example you give with being empathetic, just being kind, being open, not understanding necessarily why someone might be having a bad day, not know, you don't have the ability to know their story, but it doesn't matter, that you can still treat them kindly and still be open and still treat them like a human being. It
Yeah.
sounds so basic, but it's one of those things that happens less and less frequently, that it kind of contributes to the deterioration of relationships between people that don't know each other, and when we talk
Right.
about violence in the home, that do know each other and just treat each other poorly. We are kind of already on time somehow, shockingly. I could certainly ask you questions for another 30 minutes, but I did want to end here.
Yeah.
Therapy is a term that is misidentified, misdefined, uh, not looked at positively sometimes, but it works, and it generally works well for those who've had the experience in it. So for those people who are unaware of what happens in therapy or have a negative view of that word, why does it work, and how can we make it more normalized, that especially, the title in the book with a country in therapy, how can we make it more acceptable to others, that this is something that we should champion, or that we should certainly not look down upon for somebody who's looking for help?
Yeah, I mean, there's a million answers to that question. I'll say one today, and that is that most people survive what's the most stressful in their life by mobilizing their defenses. They wall off, or they become tough, or they become pleasers, or we do something to mobilize our defenses when we feel threatened in any way, from a minor thing to something really major. And usually those defenses are what we learned in our conditioning that never worked in the first place. And we do them and again, thinking they're going to work this time, but they don't, because they don't heal relationship. And what we really want is to be in loving connection with other human beings. So our defenses might look like they protect us from further harm, but they actually don't get us what we're after, which is loving, safe, cooperative connection with other people. And in the therapy process, in any good therapy process, it is safe to drop those defenses and understand, learn, dive into where we develop them, how we develop them, what purpose they served, ultimately to learn a way of being in the world with other human beings that is still protective of ourselves, but not defended. It's still open to relationship. It's still open to repair. It's still committed to repair without, destroying all of our appropriate boundaries. So I would say that's one big reason. And there's many. If we had another half an hour, I could tell you many more. But one of the reasons why I brought that up is because this is what we do as a nation. We're so invested in defense instead of getting to the heart of a problem and actually resolving it. That's a teaser for a whole other book.
No, it's for sure, and that I think that also hints upon the kind of immediate the immediate need for resolution or solutions that we've seen over the last 20 years or so, that we want our answers right now, or that we want situations resolved in a way that we can have no longer have it prolonged. That if we want something, that there's that patient, or if they kind of work towards something, that mentality has kind of eroded. So I think that makes sense. And uh,
Can I say one more quick
of
thing?
course, yes.
I think one of the stigmas around psychotherapy still for many people is that it's a sign of weakness to be vulnerable. It's a sign of weakness to express your emotions. It's a sign of weakness to cry, or there's a fear, if I cry, I'll never stop and I got to get myself together and get out there. When in fact, it takes enormous courage and tremendous strength to be vulnerable and to delve deep into what hurt us and come out the other side. It actually takes enormous courage and bravery and hard work. So I say it's not for the faint of heart. It's
No,
actually easier to fight. It's easier to be defended.
and that visual you give of, I don't want to cry because I don't know if I'll be able to stop. That's one that I don't think is common either. That it's like, it's easier to be defensive. It's easier to wall this up and not let it out because I'm
Right.
afraid of what might happen if I don't.
Right.
Um, Phyllis, this has been wonderful. We will certainly post links to the books. Where can our listeners find you or connect if they want to learn more?
Yeah, I'm on most of the social media: Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and I have a lot of videos on YouTube. But the best place to reach me is on my website, which is www.phyllisleavitt.com. And please, if you're a listener and you want more information, sign in for my newsletter, and you'll also be, the first to know when my book is actually in print. It's coming out next year.
Excellent. So we will post all that information. I wish you luck and continued success with the books, and for helping as many people as you have helped, and continue to do so. So Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me. You've been a wonderful podcast host.
Well, thank you.